I like storms. Big ones feel honest to me, no pretending. When the sky opens and the windows hum, everything else fades. That night, the thunder rolled long and deep. I made coffee, sat on the couch under a blanket, and let the rain be the only soundtrack. It was one of those nights you think will be small and forgettable. The movie I was watching blurred into the rain after 20 minutes. I heard my phone vibrate on the end table and picked it up without thinking. The number was local, but I didn't recognize it. I answered because sometimes life needs a polite hello. Hello? Silence. Then something low and steady on the line. Not silence exactly, but the wet sound of rain and distant static. For a second, I thought it was my phone picking up the storm outside. I listened, waited, nothing else. I hung up. I went back to the movie, but the house felt different, smaller somehow. I told myself to relax. People get wrong number calls in storms, phones drop calls. My thumb circled the rim of the mug until the steam cooled. The lights flickered twice. The TV blinked, and then everything went dark. The first rush of thunder made the windows shake. I lit a candle. The small flame looked ridiculous against the blackout. I went downstairs to check the breaker out of habit, flashlight in hand. The panel felt warm when I touched it, or maybe my hands were cold. The main switch worked, but nothing came back. The whole block was dark. I thought about calling the power company, then remembered there was no signal in the cellar and went back upstairs. I had the candle on the sill and watched rain run like glass across the glass. After a while, I heard a creak at the back gate. It's a small, old hinge, and it never moves on its own. The gate swung open with a soft, wet squeal that sounded wrong in the heavy night. A silhouette stood just beyond the yard. At first, it was only a darkness without a face, an outline with shoulders hunched under a soaked jacket. He did not move toward the house. He did not call out. He simply stood there under the rain and watched the back door as if counting something. I could have opened the door and shouted. I could have turned on every light in the house. I did none of those things. I stood at the glass and watched him watch the house. For a long minute, I tried to map a reason. A lost hiker seeking shelter, a neighbor, someone hurt. The wind stole each idea until all that remained was the image of a person standing in the storm. When his arm lifted, he had something small and bright in his hand, a phone or a flashlight. The light blinked once, and then my phone began to ring from somewhere in the living room, like it suddenly knew where I was sitting. I ran for my phone. The number matched the one that had called before. My hands were wet from the candle wax I had touched a moment earlier. I didn't answer. It rang twice more, and I watched the figure through the window. When I turned back to the living room, he was gone. Only the gate moved with a slow calm in the wind. I thought of calling someone, my sister, a neighbor, but the storm made me think in small, panicked circles. If the person was standing in my yard earlier, did that mean he could be anywhere now? Had he left? The practical decision seemed to dissolve into fear. I let it ring out and then watched the screen. A text arrived in the same instant my phone stopped ringing. I liked the way the house looks with all its lights off. The words read like a fact, not a threat, but facts feel heavier than threats. I moved to the window and checked the backyard again. The figure was gone. The gate hung closed. I called the non-emergency line, then hung up and dialed 911. The operator asked calm questions in a voice trained to be steady. I told her about the calls and the man I'd seen. I told her the timeline as best as I could. First call, second call, the gate opening, the light in his hand. She asked whether I had a camera on the porch. I lied and said yes because I thought it would make the response faster. I'm sure she could tell the difference in my voice between certainty and guess, but she promised to have an officer check the area and kept me on the line. While I waited, I moved through the house like someone trying to lock time in place. I checked bolts twice. I pushed the heavy bookshelf to block the back door on reflex. Ridiculous, but small actions make the waiting bearable. The knock started on the front door, not soft, not polite, heavy and steady as if whoever was there wanted to make sure the door heard them. The sound shook the windows each time. My phone buzzed with another message. Image received 9:11 p.m., low-res photo of the front door from knee level. The photo arrived blurry and wet-looking, like it had been taken in the rain or through a fogged lens. You could see the grain of the front step wood and a smear near the knob, as if someone had pressed a wet hand against the surface. The image was taken from a low angle, as if the sender knelt. The timestamp said 9:10. The building in the picture looked exactly like my porch. My hands shook so hard I dropped the phone once and fumbled it back up. I remember thinking then how my brain tried to barter. If I stay very still, maybe nothing will see me. I had the sense that the person at the door could hear me breathing through the glass. The operator stayed with me, voice in one ear like an anchor. She could hear the knocking when I pressed the phone toward the door. She told me an officer was 3 minutes away. The knock stopped just as she said it, as if someone had simply chosen to stop. I crept to the peephole with the weight of the phone in my hand. There, for a loose second, I saw a shape at the bottom of the door, a dark patch where a face might be. It moved. The door handle turned, and the chain shook like a small animal. Someone tried the knob. It was slow and purposeful, like someone testing the patience of the lock. Then, tires on wet street, a voice yelling, the crackle of a radio, and a light swept across the front yard. An officer's flashlight found the man, and he bolted. I heard running, the slap of wet shoes on the pavement, the officer's call, and then a figure arcing into the storm and disappearing into the night between flashes of lightning. The officer returned an empty-handed minute later. He checked the yard, went up the neighbors' driveways, and then stood on my porch, breathing heavy from the run. He took my statement, handled my phone with gloves, and told me he'd run the number. He was apologetic but brisk. People do stupid things in storms, he said. They also sometimes run from us. He recommended I stay with someone tonight. The next morning, the porch looked ordinary in a way that felt like a trick. No prints, no slid mud, no obvious smear on the knob, only wet wood and the tread marks of the rain. The officer called me later and said the number was traced to a burner that had come up clean. They checked nearby CCTV and found a grainy blur of someone moving past the yard at 9:09 p.m., but nothing clear enough to ID. Weeks later, I found, folded inside an old bill, a printout of the 3 messages. I kept them in a drawer. Sometimes I look at them and play the night again in my head, slower this time, noting choices I could have made differently. I think about how close the figure stood, how small the light would have been in his palm. I think about how ordinary the phone call felt before everything went dark. Names and identifying details are changed to protect people involved. This account is my own memory of the night, supported by the call logs, messages, and the officer's notes I was given. I like the way the house looks with all its lights off. I still like storms sometimes. I just like them with other people now. Before moving to the next scary story, subscribe to Mr. Voes, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments which part scared you most. I needed one night that was only mine. The house was full of moving boxes and quiet apologies, my sister coming the next morning to help clear out the family cabin, and I wanted a small, private exit before the work and the talking and the heavy breathing of people packing. So I drove out the old logging road until the gravel turned to ruts, left the truck where the trees seemed to begin, and walked in with a tiny pack and a stubborn sense that being alone would make things simpler. The clearing I chose was small and round, a bowl in the forest where the pines leaned back and let the sky show. I set the tent up, pulled out a cheap stove, and made coffee that tasted like metal and pine smoke. The first hour felt like permission. The fire was low and steady. The world narrowed to the ring of flame, the steam, the read of the map on my phone, and the way my hands shook just a little less with every sip. It was exactly the kind of night I said I needed. After the second cigarette and a slow, quiet pot of coffee, there was a sound that did not belong. It was far, a thin whistle at first, halting and like someone testing a tune. I listened because I had to, like you listen when a small animal pads close to a window. The whistle stopped. The trees stitched their own answers. I told myself it was a hunter or a lost camper, someone passing a long way off. The sensible thoughts are always the first to arrive. When the whistle came again, it was closer and had a small, childish lilt, the kind of half-song people whistle when they think no one is listening. My mug cooled in my hands and the flame threw shadows sharp across the dirt. I stood and walked the edge of the clearing, following the thin trail toward the creek, thinking I might find a flashlight or a campsite. The ground was soft and the boot prints were fresh. 2 sets, heavy, a long stride and a returning one. They led to the low bank and away into the trees, then back like someone walking and thinking and walking again. I took a picture because taking pictures feels like proof even when it does nothing at all. They were not frequent prints. They were not the prints of the weekend hiker with light shoes. These were older boots, worn, the kind that make a heavy mark in wet earth. There was a drag in one print, as if something heavy had been pulled. A rational part of me stepped forward and invented possibilities. Hunters, forest workers, kids playing a joke. None of those ideas fit as well as the fact that the prints felt deliberate, like a path someone had chosen to make and leave. I put the phone away and walked back to the fire. At the lip of the clearing, a strip of fabric, bright, too clean for that place, hung from a low branch like a ribbon. When I untied it, it was a single child's mitten, soft and small, not frozen or old. The color bled a little from rain. I tucked it in my jacket because I did not want to walk back with it on the branch. Carrying it felt like carrying an accusation. Someone was here and whoever it was had been close enough to leave a child's glove in the dark. I texted my sister a picture and a line that felt braver than I felt. Found weird mitten. Probably hunters. Don't freak. Her reply came quick and normal. Probably. Call me if you need anything. Those words should have settled me, but they did not. The forest had a way of feeling watchful when you are alone and have nothing but a headlamp and a cup of coffee. Sometime after midnight, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, and when I picked up, there was nothing but wind and a thin, wet sound like someone breathing through a mouthful of water. I hung up after a few seconds because staying on the line felt like letting someone listen to me breathe. The call came back once more, and then there was a voicemail. Static, and a sound I could not place at first, like cloth dragged on wood, and then a word said soft and hurried, "Not yet." The words were almost nothing, but they fit into me like a small stone. I listened to the message twice, then 3 times, until each repeat made the strange syllable sound like a stranger's name. I thought about packing then and there. I thought about the truck and the highway and how safe a highway light makes you feel. But the night felt stubborn, and my desire to prove I wasn't afraid was stronger than my reason. I stayed. Later, when the headlamp was low and the fire had dimmed to coals, I saw a light move between the trunks at the edge of the clearing. It was low, like a lantern carried by a walking person, and it bobbed in a steady, human way. I watched it from the dark and felt the old animal part of my mind go very quiet. The light paused and then moved on, nearer between trees, not searching but being. There was nothing in its movement that made sense. It did not aim toward camp or toward the road. It seemed to be walking with a purpose I could not name. I packed fast and tried to be careful. I told myself to be quiet and not to run so I wouldn't trip. But the instruction left my mouth like a child's protest. When I zipped the tent to reach for my gloves, the flap was already undone. The zipper nicotine smoked and wet as if someone had slid it out from the other side. A smear of damp earth trailed from the tent lip into the moss like a small finger had dragged through. For a moment I considered laughter, the absurdity of the suggestion that someone had come inside my tiny world. Then all the rational thoughts backed away because my heart had taken the lead. I left everything and ran. There is a strange panic in running through a forest when the roads are not visible and your truck is a light at the edge of a small world. Branches snapped at my face and caught my sleeves. My lungs shouted for air and my boots slipped on the wet roots. On the gravel, I slammed the truck door and locked it and felt the thud against the frame as if that metal could bar the world into order. I sat with the engine running too long, hands clamped around the wheel, and drove until the trees thinned and the highway lights came in strips and the radio sounded like a small chorus of ordinary things. When I had signal, I called the non-emergency line and then 911 because my voice had a wobble that wanted someone else to hold the night for a while. The dispatcher asked calm, practiced questions. "Where are you? Can you wait? Do you have anyone with you?" I told her about the prints, the mitten, the light moving between the trunks. I told her about the voicemail that had said "not yet." She promised an officer would check the area and told me to stay where it was safe. I did. I drove to a diner with lights and coffee and stayed until dawn peeled back the dark into a tired pale. At first light, I went back to the clearing with an officer who walked the line slow and methodical and took notes in a small book. The prints were still there near the creek, heavy and deep, and the tent peg was half pulled. The mitten I had tucked in my jacket was not in my pocket when I reached in for it. I swear I had it when I ran. The officer took pictures and asked me if I wanted him to take the items to evidence. He sounded more curious than worried, like someone who had heard similar calls before and filed them under odd and unsolved. He used the word burner when I gave him the number from the voicemail, a phone registered nowhere. He asked me how certain I was it had said "not yet." I told him I had listened to it, and it had said words that were not quite clear, and that made it worse. I kept the clearing's photograph on my phone and the image of the boot prints, though I did not have the mitten to show. That missing glove lodged in me like an accusation. I had seen it, and then I had not. Days passed, and no one claimed the mitten, though I had no way of proving I had had it. The officer called once to say the number came up clean, and the nearby trail cams had only grainy footage of a light moving, nothing clear enough to place a face. He said sometimes the camera distorts in rain. He said sometimes there is nothing to find. The voice on the line was polite. It was the voice of someone who sees the world as a job and not as a set of small, sharp interruptions. I do not camp alone anymore. I was driving because I needed to get away. My last job had eaten my week, and I'd promised myself a night on the road to breathe. The route took me one lane deep into trees I knew only by the nameless pull-offs on the map. I could have stopped in town, but I wanted quiet, just me, the engine hum, and a cheap diner coffee when the morning came. A detour sign forced me off the highway. Road closed, follow detour. The arrows guided me down a lane slick with rain. The GPS rerouted, calm and flat. I followed the yellow line until the asphalt thinned and the trees leaned in like listeners. I pulled into a small gravel loop because my head needed a rest. There was a rest area here. Ash posts, a warped picnic table, a faded sign that read Ashland View. The place smelled of wet pine and old smoke. I left the engine on, the dome light on, and kept the radio at a whisper. A man stepped out and stood in the downpour. He wore a heavy coat with a hood that swallowed his neck and a cap with a reflective stripe. He carried a toolbox that rattled faintly. Practical boots, a yellow vest under the coat, a clipboard tucked under one arm. At first glance, he made sense in this place. He belonged to the night work that repairs roads after storms. I locked the doors because locking is the small control you have. He whistled once, a clear, low note that cut under the rain. He called, polite and close. "Road crew, county. Everything all right in there?" His voice was practiced. It was the kind of voice that belongs to people who knock on doors and get strangers to trust them. When I peered through the glass, he tipped his head like a man checking his route and said, "I'm headed to the culvert down the lane, a washout. Map says we should have a barricade up. Just doing a run-through." That was a tidy fact. If he were an actual county worker, this was a normal, believable errand. He seemed to want to be helpful. He had a paper map that he unfolded, water beading on the ink. He tapped the corner and traced with a gloved finger as if confirming coordinates. I heard the toolbox rattle again and smelled wet leather and tar. "I'll be only a minute," he added. "You okay?" He used that word like it was a checkbox. When he said my name, I froze. "Ellie," he called, like someone calling a neighbor across a fence. I had never given him my name. I had never met him. He made it sound familiar in a way that left me raw. I felt the small, rational part of me step forward and list reasons. County crew, wrong place, coincidence. I told him, "I'm fine, because you say that to strangers and then you watch them." I eased the truck into gear because standing still felt like a place they could creep into. The first man nodded and moved aside. He walked slow and measured to the edge of the trees, toolbox clanking once on the boards. Another car came out of the dark behind him. It eased to a stop and the engine folded into silence. A second man climbed out with a plastic cup and a cigarette smoldering in his hand. He wore a jacket with no reflective stripes, plain dark, and his boots made no sound on the wet gravel. He moved like someone who knew this clearing and did not need the light. The first man came back toward my truck. He smiled small, the practiced kind that does the work of friendliness. "We're just checking on people," he said. "The road's tricky. We get folks stuck out late." He held up a paper badge the size of a playing card. It was laminated and fit into a cheap sleeve. At a glance it read County Maintenance. It had an emblem that looked official. I let myself believe it for a heartbeat because when you see a badge you want to believe. Then I noticed the badge was not clipped to his coat. He held it by the corner like someone showing a business card. When he tucked it away, I saw no metal clip, no printed phone number, nothing I could verify. "Move along to the overflow," he said, pointing with a gloved hand toward a low trail that snaked into the woods. "We'll keep you safe there." His voice was slick with gentle persuasion. He spoke as if he'd done this 1,000 times and every line was rehearsed. The man with the cigarette watched me from the picnic table and smiled like someone enjoying a private joke. My phone buzzed on the dash. An unknown number. A text popped up. "We thought you might still be here." The words landed the way cold does when it touches bare skin. I stared at the message like it could be a mistake. I thought of the detour sign, the washed-out culvert, the two men who matched the story until they didn't. I told myself to be reasonable. I told myself to move. I wanted to drive straight back to the highway and not to stop until the neon of an all-night store comforted me. I started the truck and eased forward. The first man placed one hand in my headlight for a second and let it rest there like a polite obstruction. When I moved, he set his face calm and lifted his chin, smiling that practiced smile again. He reached down by the picnic table and picked up something small and round from the wet wood. He held it up, and for a blink I saw a photo, a glossy square with faded colors. He tucked it into his pocket, and the movement was casual like folding laundry. I kept the truck moving, the wheels snapping wet gravel, but they followed. The man with the cigarette walked alongside the passenger door, and the other man mirrored me in my rear view like a shadow. I drove faster, hard in engine. The trees closed and then opened more. The road that led back to the highway felt longer than it should have been. When I finally hit the main road and the radio breathed life into the cabin with a late-night DJ, I stopped and pulled over at the next light. The men were gone. The clearing looked like something from a dream. A ragged sign, a picnic table, a ring of posts. No footprints, no trash, no photograph. At home, I checked my messages again and the unknown number had not called back. I replayed the small scene in my head. The photograph he had picked up on the table. What was on it? Why did it matter enough to tuck into a pocket mid-rain? I slept at my sister's house that night because the idea of being alone with those smiles in my head felt wrong. The next morning, curiosity gnawed like hunger. I drove back to the rest stop because curiosity is a slow heat. The place sat ordinary in daylight. People stopped for coffee. A pickup had filled the loop. I stepped out and walked to the picnic table. There, folded small and left right in the center, was a cheap Polaroid. My fingers did something useless and honest. They opened it. A small girl smiles on a wooden porch, her hair in braids. She holds a rabbit stuffed toy in one hand. The rabbit, one ear a little crooked, was the one my mother kept in an attic box. The Polaroid smelled faintly of smoke and damp, and something human having been up close to it. I remember the truck radio song like a heartbeat, the way it threaded through my fear with something ordinary. I remember the man's fingers lifting the photo like it meant less than I thought. I remember the county badge and the way it had no clip, like a prop. I filed a report at the sheriff's office and they were patient and practical. They asked if I wanted prints taken and I said yes because I wanted a hand on the night. They used the word transient and made an appointment to check the cameras on the highway. They were kind, but not surprised. They told me to consider my options and to be careful. I do not drive the back lanes at night anymore. I plan my runs so I stop in lit places. I leave my keys in my hand when I get out of a vehicle. I only know this. They knew the sound of me, and they left a piece of my childhood on a wet table like a marker. I still check the back seat before I get in. I was 3 hours from home and pretending I could keep driving forever. I was tired the way you are when you push yourself past a good kind of tired into a dangerous kind. Blink and you're a mile down the road tired. I needed caffeine and bathroom, nothing dramatic. I saw the light ahead, a single pump by a low-roofed store, the kind of place that smells like stale coffee and old maps. I pulled in and killed the engine. The lot was almost empty. A work truck sat by the side, caked in mud. The attendant was a thin man behind the counter with a cap pulled low. He had a hospital mug and a newspaper folded like a promise. When I went to the coffee station, the brew hissed in a pot like it had been waiting for someone desperate. "Long drive?" he asked without looking at me. "Just trying to stay awake," I said. He poured my cup and slid it across like he'd learned the tilt by habit. He watched the monitor over my shoulder as if it were the whole point of his night. The screen showed the looped black and white of the lot, my little pickup, the 2 pumps, the wooden post sign. I saw something on the screen before I saw it in the window, a silhouette, a person standing at the rear of my truck. They faced away from the store, shoulders hunched, hands in pockets. For a second I thought it was a trick of the camera. "Is that real?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He tapped the counter with a finger. "He should be headed down the ridge," he said finally. "Road crew," said he was doing a sweep of the culvert. He said it easy, like reading a name on a list. A man in an orange vest would have made sense. A road crewman with a clipboard. That's the sort of person you expect at a washed-out lane at night. The figure on the monitor wore dark clothes. No vest, no headlamp, no company logo. The person on the screen turned slowly, and in the grainy feed, the face stayed a shadow. "Guess they turned off their light," I said, and laughed to keep my voice even. The man behind the counter slid a napkin across to me. He had written only 2 words, "Don't leave." His handwriting was a little shaky. I laughed, too small to be funny. "Is that a joke?" He folded his hands like a man keeping a secret. "You should stay in here until morning. Train of thought. It's safer." His voice softened, but the eyes did not. I drank the coffee and listened to the rain hammer the roof. Every few minutes, I checked the monitor. The thing never left. It walked the perimeter of the truck and paused. Then it walked a few steps closer to the pumps, turned, and watched the store. After an hour, I asked to use the restroom. He said where it was, and his hand rested on my shoulder like it meant comfort. I walked back, the fluorescent lights making everything hard-edged. The corridor to the bathroom smelled of disinfectant and someone else's perfume. When I came back out, I froze. The monitor showed the timestamp 12 minutes behind my phone. The same minute repeated over and over. The person on the screen moved with mechanical patience. The lot looped the same handful of seconds. "It's a feed problem," I said aloud. My voice did something thin and high. He looked at me with a face that slid between helpful and hollow. "Sometimes the recorder loops when it loses signal," he said. "Old equipment." He folded the napkin away like a man putting a cover back on a wound. I stepped to the window and looked. The lot was empty under the rain. The truck stood lonely and ordinary. No one moved. "Why would it be real on tape but not here?" I asked. He shrugged like a man who has folded that question into too many nights. "Technology does strange things. Folks miss things, forget, people are tired, they fall asleep on the road." He smiled a small, tired smile that did not reach his eyes. The knock came on the side door before I could decide to leave. 3 slow taps. I heard them in my chest like an alarm. Whoever was at the door called out in a clipped voice, "Ma'am, we need to check your vehicle. County maintenance. Please open up." He used an official word. He knew where to stand in a sentence to make people trust him. He sounded like a man who had practiced compassion until it became performance. I did not move. "Don't," the attendant said. He reached beneath the counter and his hand closed on something metallic. He did not show me what it was. "Please, sit, stay close, don't go." The knocking stopped. For a long breath, the rain was the only sound. Then the call came again, louder. "Open up, we need to check the back. You may have been traveling with somebody, Staben. It's safer to move to the overflow." His voice had a patience you use to fold a letter. The storeman's face tightened. He patted the napkin on the counter the way someone pats a pocket as if to check for coins. I moved, slow, toward the register. My hands had the small tremble of someone who's listening to their own breath. I asked the attendant a single careless question to buy time. "Who's he with?" He blinked like a man surprised into honesty. "With his pal," he said. "2 of them, not the sort you'd want knocking on your window." The door handle rattled. I felt my skin go thin. The cigarette-scented voice outside was suddenly near the glass. "Open up," it said. "Come on, sweetheart." The man behind the counter slid a drawer open and set something on the register. A key. Heavy, old, ringed with tags. He held it out to me like a lifeline. "Drive," he said. "Go now. Don't stop. Head for the highway and keep going. Don't go back the way you came." My feet moved as if someone else had claimed them. I did not question the key. I took it, palms sweaty, and moved out through the door he unlocked. The rain wiped my face like a curtain as I ran to the truck. The figure on the monitor had shifted. It stood now where I had been when I reached the counter. I started the engine and pulled into the lane, and the man with the cigarette stepped in front of my bumper like a slow gate. He put his hands on the hood and stared at me. He had a smile that did not touch his mouth. "Thought you might be stubborn," he said. "You don't want to leave. You should stay." I backed up and hit the gas. The truck surged over wet stone. I didn't look back until I hit the highway lights. When I finally did glance in the rear view, the rest stop had the small, ordinary look of a place that had never been strange. A sign, an empty lot, a single dim light that blinked. I pulled off at the first 24-hour diner, hands shaking so badly I could not hold my cup. The attendant there watched me as if I had mud on my face. I tried to tell the story, but the words snagged. The police came eventually and took my statement. They checked the lot. The work truck was there. It had plaster dried on its bumper, like it had been out doing real work. No evidence of that man or his friend. They asked if I wanted photos taken. I said yes. I sent them the security footage the gas station man let me copy. The clip showed the lot in looping seconds. The timestamp was wrong. In one frame, the figure stood behind my truck, and then, quite clearly, the figure moved where I had been standing in the store. When the detective asked if I recognized anyone from the footage, I said no. I kept the copy on my phone because proof is a small comfort. At home, I left the key on my bedside table like a talisman. I called the number on the county maintenance page the next morning and asked if anyone was working that night. The clerk read a list and said no. The map of the route showed no sweep scheduled. 2 weeks later, I found a Polaroid tucked into the glove box. It was wet at the edges. The photo had someone's shoulder in it, a hood, a mud splatter. In the background, the faint shape of the store. On the back, in a hurried hand, stayed safe. See you soon. No signature. I do not take the back roads anymore. I tell myself that people are strange for reasons that have nothing to do with me. But that line on the monitor, the one that put a shadow where I had been, sits in my head like a blank map. I thought I left him in the wet gravel, but sometimes at night on quiet streets, I wonder whether I am the one replaying. Names were changed. This is what I remember. I drive with the radio on now, loud enough to drown small voices. I'm Sarah, 27, and I lived alone in an old apartment building near downtown. I work nights at a bakery, so I sleep during the day and stay awake late. I usually keep my apartment quiet. Lamps low, tea on the table, the oven timer set for the early morning. This happened last winter, around 2 a.m., on a night when I should have been half asleep but wasn't. I remember the exact moment I woke up. My laptop had fallen asleep with a TV show on. A streetlight made a pale stripe on the floor. I had pulled my blanket up and I was lying very still when I saw a movement at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was a trick, the kind of half dream you get when you are too tired but not asleep. But whatever I saw did not belong to a dream. There was a figure standing in the doorway to my bedroom. I felt the blanket tighten around my chest. The shape was a man in a red shirt and jeans. He stood perfectly still, like someone who had been posed there. I tried to make a sound. Nothing. My throat felt heavy. I blinked hard and looked again. He had no head, not missing, not blurred, just gone. At the top of his neck was a clean emptiness, a smooth collar and the red shirt bunched at the seam. No skin, no hair, no face, just emptiness. My heart slammed so hard I thought it would burst. I sat up slowly because I couldn't move in a panic. I was completely awake now. The figure did not move. It did not breathe. It was like a mannequin someone had left standing in my doorway, except it felt alive in the wrong way. The streetlight made the emptiness look darker than the rest of the room. I thought sleep paralysis at first. I had read about it, but I could move. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My hands shook, but I could pick it up. I turned on the flashlight and trained it toward the figure. The light hit his shirt and the collar, and the hollow inside his neck looked deeper and darker. No skin, just dark cloth and a smooth, empty gap. I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" I whispered, stupid as that was. The man did not answer. He did not even shift his shoulders. The flat calm of him frightened me more than if he had screamed. I slipped out of bed and walked to the doorway, the floor cold under my bare feet. My instinct was to touch the shoulder, to make sure he was real, to wake him up if he was sleeping. I reached out and placed my hand tentatively on the red cloth. It felt like cloth. He was real. My fingers sank into the shirt and found the fabrics give. I flinched and pulled back like I had touched something hot. The whole apartment smelled like copper and old dust. The hum of the refrigerator sounded too loud. I moved toward the hallway slowly and involuntarily. The figure remained perfectly still. In the living room, the TV flickered. On the street, a car passed by and its light washed across his shirt and then away. The darkness in the man's neck gleamed back at me. I had the silly, terrified thought that someone had tied a bag over their head and tucked the neck in. Maybe a prank. But the more I looked, the less sense the idea made. No one could stand that still for so long. And why would someone choose my apartment? Why would they wait? My phone rang suddenly, a shrill sound that cut the silence. It was a number I didn't know. The ringing did the strange thing where you expect someone to speak, and whoever is calling knows you are watching the doorway. I stared at the phone, and it stopped. No voicemail, no message. The cold moved through me all the same. I backed away and grabbed the baseball bat I kept behind the door. If this was a person, I wanted to be ready. I crept back into the hallway and raised the bat. My hands shook, but I forced myself forward. The man stood in the doorway like a statue. Up close, his shirt had a faint smell of smoke. The emptiness in his neck looked almost like a tunnel into nothing. I moved closer. He didn't blink. I lifted the bat and hit the side of his shoulder with a dull thud. The sound seemed wrong, like hitting wood. He didn't move. I hit him again, harder. Again, nothing. It was as if he was stuffed with cotton, but my bat made no dent in him. No pain, no flinch. I hit him until my arm burned, and he stayed as still as a photograph. This is the moment I tell myself I should have run, called the police, left the building. But I didn't. I was frozen by a mixture of fear and the odd belief that if I moved too quickly, this would disappear and I would never understand what I had seen. When I finally let the bat drop, the doorway was empty, gone. The figure had vanished so completely that the hallway looked normal, as if nobody had been standing there at all. No marks, no dropped shoes, no smell left behind except for a faint trace of smoke. My chest tightened in a new way. Not from fear this time, but from confusion and the awareness I had been in the presence of something impossible. I called the police. I told the dispatcher my hands were shaking and my voice sounded small in the quiet apartment. They said an officer would be sent. I told the neighbor on the way down in the stairwell. She peered into my doorway and didn't see anything. The officer came, walked through, looked at the hall, asked routine questions. He called it probably a person in a costume or a tenant prank. He left, which made me feel smaller and lonelier. Later, I watched the footage from the hallway security camera. I had never checked it before. The camera angle covered the corridor outside my door. The timestamp read 2 minutes after I had first seen the figure. At first, all I saw was my door creak open and then nothing. There was a flicker. Then a shape walked by the frame, a blur of red. It moved like a person, but its head was not visible. The frame cut at the neck and the space above the shoulders was blank. The video lost its audio for a beat. When the feed came back, the hallway was empty. I showed the feed to my sister. She said maybe it was the wind on a coat or a trick of pixels. She wanted to believe a technical glitch explained everything. But on my nightstand, the blanket was pulled back where I had once been, and my heart was pounding loud in my ears. I moved out within the week. I told myself I was looking for a place closer to work. But the truth is, I couldn't sleep in that apartment anymore. Sometimes in a grocery checkout line, my eyes catch the collar of a shirt and I see his empty neck again. I still don't have an answer. I don't know who he was or why he stood at my door staring into the dark. I only know the feeling of being watched by something that should not be. When I tell this story now, I do it with the same small voice I used in that empty hallway. I don't want to believe any of it. But some nights, when the city is too quiet, I think about the doorway and I check the locks twice before I sleep. I still wake up sometimes and wish it was only a dream. My name is Michael. I live with my wife and our older dog in a quiet suburb. I work from home most days, and I love a simple routine: morning coffee, dog walk, and early bed when I have to. This story happened last winter, about 3 years ago. We had been up late celebrating New Year's quietly, and the house had finally settled to sleep. But something outside that night changed the way I look at my own porch. It was around 4 a.m. My dog Max woke me quietly with a whine. He rarely woke in the night, so I knew something was wrong. I put on my sweatshirt and slippers, and we slipped outside to the back porch. Frost covered the wooden steps. My breath came out in little clouds. The yard looked like a folded blanket under the moon. Max did his business quickly, but then he froze and stared down the porch steps. I shined my flashlight and saw nothing at first. The yard was empty except for the swing and the dark tree line. Then I heard it. A strange, quiet laugh. It was not normal laughter. It sounded soft, like someone chuckling to themselves in a low tone. It came from the porch steps. My skin crawled. I tightened my grip on Max's leash. The laughter was in sync. 2 voices, a man and a woman, laughing together as if sharing something only they found funny. I stepped closer to the light and could make out a figure standing at the base of the steps. It was tall, too tall. The porch light turned him into a black cutout. He stood very still, like a shadow you could step into. I could not see a face, not clear features, just a dark, human-shaped void under the porch lamp. Max growled and tried to pull me back toward the house. He is usually a calm dog, but he trembled. My hands tightened. I tried to call out, "Hey, who's there?" My voice sounded too loud and thin. The figure didn't move. The laughter stopped. There was a long, thick silence that felt heavier than the cold. I checked the side gate. It was latched. I checked for footprints in the frost. None. Whoever or whatever stood by the steps had not left anything. I felt my throat dry. The porch light hummed. I shut the back door and tried to lock it. My hand froze on the deadbolt. I had a horrible sense that if I made any sound, the figure would change its mind and come up the steps. The dog lunged at the door and pressed his nose to the glass, staring at the dark like he could see more than I could. I shut the curtains and went back inside. I told my wife what I'd seen in a whisper. She asked if I was sure I hadn't imagined it, and I wanted to believe I had. We sat in the living room with the lights on and the television playing loudly. We ate a bowl of leftover soup and tried to joke about New Year's and the terrible fireworks. But I couldn't shake the image of that black shape. At 5 a.m., the house still hummed with sleep. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I looked again at the back door window just to be sure. The porch light had gone dim, but through the curtains I could see a shadow moving across the snow. It stepped away from the window like a person leaving a room. It carried something, a small bundle that glowed faintly green in the moonlight. I opened the door and called out in a shaky voice. "Hey, who's there? What do you want?" The night swallowed my words. Nothing answered. Then, from the dark line of trees came the soft sound of small feet padding across the snow. Not human footfall, too light, like bare feet on a soft carpet. When I next looked toward the porch, there was a pale smear on the top step. It looked like frost had melted in a small curved shape, as if an outline of something had been pressed there and then removed. I reached down and touched it. It left my finger cold and wet, but no pattern, no print. The hair on my arm stood on end. That morning, I checked the security camera footage from the back motion sensor. The motion sensor recorded a tiny, noisy clip at 4:03 a.m. There was movement at the edge of the video, a black figure gliding into the frame close to the porch. The image was grainy. In 2 frames, it looked like an empty space, a hole where a person should be. The clip ended with a soft greenish dot moving past the frame. I scrubbed the footage over and over. The file had a small gap of a few seconds where static took over. After the gap, the porch was empty again. I filed the clip away and tried to sleep. I checked the windows for weeks after. I moved the motion detector. I kept the porch light on. We asked neighbors if they'd seen anything. One of them said she had heard a low laugh a few streets away a night or two later and thought kids were playing. But our neighborhood is quiet. Kids were inside, at bed. Another neighbor said her dog had not gone outside for 2 nights in a row because he seemed anxious. That small detail made me feel less alone. Sometimes I think of the 2 voices laughing together. They sounded like people who wanted to be seen and also wanted to hide. The figure never came closer to the house on any other night. Whatever stood on our steps that night did not seem to want to break the line between yard and porch. It lingered there, like a message left in shadow. I installed an additional camera aimed at the steps, this time with clear night vision. For weeks, I recorded nothing unusual. But at midnight on a night in March, the camera caught a tiny frame, something small moving across the top step like a hand sliding along wood. The color was pale and blurred. I paused the clip. It looked like a child's mitten or a small doll's hand. We never found that mitten. I still keep the motion sensor on and the light on at night. Max sleeps at the foot of the bed and wakes at the smallest sound. We still lock the door twice. I don't like to go out late anymore. I don't like to be alone on the porch. If I learned anything, it's this. Sometimes something can stand just beyond your light and watch you without ever stepping into your world. Sometimes the laugh is the thing that stays with you long after the night has passed. I still wake sometimes thinking I hear 2 people laughing softly outside, and I always check the window. My name is Dan. I moved into a cheap duplex 3 months ago. The rent was low and the house needed work, but I liked the quiet. My neighbor, a man named Carl, was a quiet sort who kept to himself. We said hello on the porch sometimes, nothing more. This happened in late autumn, one of those nights when the wind runs through the trees and the whole street smells like wet leaves. One evening I was taking the trash out. The moon was hidden by clouds. I looked across at Carl's house and noticed the basement window was lit. Basements are not usually lit that late. The light was a dim yellow that made the glass look like a lantern. I paused with the trash bag in my hand and watched. At first, I thought he had guests. Then I noticed movement. Not people moving around normally. The shapes were still, like dolls. I squinted and saw what looked like several heads pressed near the glass, facing outward. They did not move like people moving. They moved together, tiny shifts in the dark. For a moment, one of them seemed to look directly at me. I felt my skin go cold. I should have gone home then. I should have kept walking and pretended not to see. But I stood there, frozen, until the light went off and every shape dissolved back into darkness. I drove that night with the image in my head. For the next few days, I watched the basement window anytime I passed outside. The next morning, I politely asked Carl if he had been having people over. He looked at me blankly and shook his head. "No," he said. "I don't have anyone with me." He smiled like it was a curious question. I said nothing more. The strange sounds started that week. At 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke to low chanting through the shared wall, a sound like people whispering words in a rhythm. The voice was not English. It sounded like nonsense syllables, but it carried a heavy weight. My dog started waking, growling quietly. I blamed old pipes at first, but the sounds came in patterns, almost like a song. A few nights later, I went to check the backyard camera I installed for package theft. The motion detector had triggered at 2:13 a.m. The clip showed a flash at Carl's basement window, only a fraction of a second of bright light. When I zoomed, I saw a pale face pressed against the glass. The eyes were blank and reflective, the skin like paper. I nearly dropped my phone. I should have told the landlord. I should have done something formal. Instead, I kept watching. Sleep left me. Each night I listened for the low chant. Each night I dreaded what I might find in the morning. One night, the sounds were worse. There was scraping across the basement floor and then a heavy thump. It sounded like furniture moving. I stood in the kitchen with my cup of coffee and listened. The house beyond our wall was quiet at first. Then the light in his basement came on like a slow pulse. This time, I saw through the thin curtain of glass, not a single face, but 5 faces lined up close together. Their outline was pale and close. They pressed their cheeks to the glass and stared out with a kind of patient hunger. I felt something in my chest like fear and sympathy at the same time. Who were they? People sleeping on the floor? Homeless individuals taken in? The sight did not make sense. Later, I walked over and knocked on the side door. Carl answered. "Everything okay?" I asked. He smiled, and it was a strange smile that reached his mouth but not his eyes. "Fine," he said. "They come for a while, then they go." He did not explain more. I asked, "Do you need help? Do you want me to call someone?" He waved me away. That night, I heard a scraping in the wall and then the sound of packing. When I checked the camera again the next morning, the basement was empty. No faces at the window. But in the corner near the foundation, I found a small scrap of cloth with a pattern like a child's toy. It made my stomach drop. A week later, there was a knock on my door at dawn. 2 men in plain clothes stood there. They had official patches on their jackets. One said, "Sir, we need to ask you some questions about the basement unit." I felt my blood run cold. "There have been reports," he said, "from neighbors and local services." He used words like welfare check and suspicious activity. I tried to stay calm. They wanted to come inside and see the basement. I let them. Together we walked the hallway and the inspector opened the hatch to his basement. The floor smelled like damp and old dust. In the corner of the room, we saw strange, small depressions in the floor and the outlines of blankets and boxes, as if people had slept there. There were no mattresses, just bundles. In a corner, they found some small toys, some old clothing with dates from a decade before. It looked as if someone had been living in short shifts, moving in at night for a while and leaving before daylight. The detective who came later asked me if I knew whether Carl had been involved in anything illegal. I told him what I had seen. The faces at the window, the chanting. He listened and stuck most of it under the category of transient squatting. but he recorded it. I later learned from the inspector that the house had a history. Decades ago, it had been a boarding place for migrant workers. There were records of people going missing for stretches of time and then being found elsewhere. No crime had been proven, it just had a shadowed record. What scared me most was not a single thing in the basement. It was the way the faces seemed to look right at me, as if they had been waiting for someone to notice. Their eyes were empty, but somehow expected. I felt guilty and sick for weeks afterward. I tried to imagine the people who had been there, why they returned night after night, who fed them or cleaned the blankets. I tried to imagine the fear that made anyone hide underground, behind curtains and under low lights. A month later, I moved. I found the cheap place I liked too heavy with that memory. Before I left, I knocked on Carl's door one last time. He stood there and gave the same small smile. "Take care," he said. "It's a crazy world out there." He closed the door. I drove off with my boxes packed and tried to forget the faces in the basement. I carry the images with me, though. 5 pale faces pressed to a dirty window, looking out into a world that pretends not to see them. It's the kind of thing that makes you check the people around you more carefully. Maybe sometimes people hide like that because they have no other place to be. Maybe the basement was a shelter, or maybe something worse. I never had an answer. My name is Jenna. I like to camp alone sometimes to clear my head. I'm careful. Maps, spare batteries, the usual. This story happened on a late fall trip 3 years ago. I went out for one night on a small trail loop in a state park. I planned to be back at the car before daylight. I never expected the forest to change the plan. The day was gray and cool. I set up my small tent at a primitive site near a creek and made a small fire. The place was quiet, except for birds and the whisper of the stream. I ate and read a book, then zipped into my sleeping bag early. The plan was simple: wake at dawn and hike back. At some point in the night, I woke to rain on the tent and a noise like faraway talking. I had a small handheld radio on the low Ranger frequency. I clicked it on to check for advisories. Static came through, and then a voice so calm I thought it must be my mind. "Copy that. Hold position." The voice sounded like a ranger, steady and patient. I felt relief. I curled back and tried to sleep. I never slept that night again. Around midnight, the rain stopped, and through the thin tent canvas I heard distant footsteps. I sat up and listened hard. The radio crackled, and a voice repeated my own words back to me as if it were copying them. "Ranger station. Copy," it whispered. That made me uneasy. The sound was my voice, but wrong, taped and played slower. I flicked the radio off. The forest seemed to hold its breath. At about 2 a.m., I heard a soft calling. It was a whisper that sounded like someone saying my name. It came from the dark. A small light bobbed among the trees as if someone had a lantern and moved slowly through the trunks. I thought of going out with my headlamp to find them, to say hello and confirm I wasn't alone. I held back instead. My skin prickled. My map had me on Trail 5. In the morning, I would follow the signed path back to the lot. I trusted the map. But around 2:30, I felt a tug in my chest to move, like something wanted me to go deeper into the woods. I zipped my jacket, grabbed the radio, and stepped out. The trail I followed felt wrong. The markers seemed older and moss-covered. The path twisted in ways my map did not show. I walked with my headlamp and felt the dark crowd the trees around me. Then, in the beam of my light, I saw a small sign. Ranger Station 1.2 miles. That was odd. The station should have been behind me, not ahead. I checked the map on my phone. The phone showed no signal, and the map pin drifted like fog. I heard a breathy sound near my radio, a whisper that said, "Turn back. You're not supposed to be here." The voice sounded layered, more than one whisper at once, and I felt fear in my legs like cold water. I tried to step back, and my boots stuck in soft mud. Every step I took felt heavy. I walked faster toward the light I thought was the station, but the trees closed in. I came to a small clearing and saw, against a bank of brambles, the faint shape of a maintenance gate and a rusted sign. The sign leaned, and the letters were worn, but I could make out Trail 6. My hands trembled. At that moment, my radio clicked alive, and for a second I heard my voice call out, and then the radio made a low, deep sound that did not belong to a human. It felt like the sound underwater. It whispered, "Open the gate." I stepped back and froze. The air felt like someone's breath on my face. Panic sent me running. I tried to find the trail back and instead stumbled into a thinner path that seemed to run parallel to the creek. When I looked back, the main path was gone. The trees stood like watchers, and the moonlight made the trunks resemble other shapes. I kept walking, trying to follow the sound of the creek. Then I found my car lights in the far distance, a small white square moving like a rescue. Relief came as a wave. I ran, my legs pumped, and I barely thought. I hit the gravel of the lot and saw my car idling with the headlights on. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door. My hands still shook when I started the engine. I drove away as fast as I dared. In the morning, I told the park ranger what had happened. The ranger's face grew serious. He asked me which channel I was on when the voice mimicked me. I told him channel 7 because that's what my little guide suggested. He frowned and said, "Channel 7 is for maintenance crews. Rangers don't use it. Nobody should have been answering you there." I told him about the sign that pointed the wrong way and the light that bobbed in the trees. He listened and said the park had strange old paths that people used once and then forgot, that a lot of systems were old and sometimes things got mixed up. He said some people heard voices in the park and chose to leave it unasked. I stared at him and felt a hollow ache. At home that night, I replayed everything in my head. The most troubling thing was the way my own voice had come back to me, like a copy on the radio. The ranger had said that sometimes hunters use maintenance channels to warn people. He had also said, if somebody copied your voice back at you, get away from that frequency. Don't use it. I deleted the recordings I had made that night, but late at night when the house is quiet, I sometimes think I hear a whisper on the old radio in the corner. I never went back to that trail. I still hike sometimes, more carefully. I bring a bright lantern and a friend now. I keep my radio on a different channel and I do not answer when my voice comes back at me in a strange whisper. The woods are places of peace for many, but for me the forest holds a thin voice that tries to call me farther in. I learned that night to trust the map and not a light that lies. I learned that some paths should remain unwalked after dark.